The Immortality Key: The Secret History of the Religion with No Name by Brian Murarescu.
Mr. Murarescu graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Brown University with a degree in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, which clearly prepared him for his later work. As alumnus of Georgetown Law and a member of the New York Bar, he's been practicing law internationally for 15 years. About the book. For 2,000 years prior to the birth of Christ, the ancient Greeks found revelation in their own sacraments. Sacred beverages were routinely consumed as part of the so-called ancient mysteries, elaborate rites that led initiates to the brink of death and beyond at Eleusis. Others drank the holy wine of Dionysius to become one with the god. In the 1970s, scholars, including Dr. Carl Ruck, claimed that this beer and wine, the original sacraments of Western civilization, were spiked with mind-altering drugs. In recent years, vindication for the disgrace theory has been quietly mounting in the laboratory. The constantly advancing fields of archaeobotany and archaeochemistry have been hinting at the enduring use of hallucinogenic drinks in antiquity. And with a single dose of psilocybin, the psychopharmacologists at Johns Hopkins and NYU are now producing powerful revelatory religious/mystical experiences in the lab. But the smoking gun remains elusive. If these sacraments survived for thousands of years in our remote prehistory, from the Stone Age to the ancient Greeks, did they also survive into the age of Jesus? Was the Eucharist of the earliest Christians, in fact, a psychedelic Eucharist?
Over the past year, I journeyed to Greece, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy to get to the bottom of history's best-kept secret once and for all. If a psychedelic sacrament is essential for the birth of Western civilization and Christianity, where's the proof? I sat down with the government ministers, curators, and archivists, whose mission is to guard precious relics that rarely see the light of day. I grilled the excavators, archaeobotanists, and archaeochemists who are in the field and laboratory right now, unearthing fresh evidence of our ancestors' ritualistic use of drugs and subjecting it to a battery of high-tech instrumentation. And I trekked through time with the classicists, historians, and biblical scholars who are trying to make sense of it all. Not only is there evidence of psychedelic beer and wine at the heart of the Greek and Christian mysteries, but also evidence of their suppression by the religious authorities. I spent a significant amount of time at the Vatican, developing a working relationship with the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology. I inspected the Paleo-Christian catacombs controlled by the Pope under the streets of Rome. I descended into the Vatican necropolis under St. Peter's Basilica that is never discussed in Catholic school. I analyzed little-known artifacts with the curators of the Vatican museums. I managed to root through manuscripts few have ever touched. The climax of my time in the Holy See was a behind-the-scenes appointment with the recently opened archives of the Inquisition, targeting key documents that have never before been translated into English. The result is a jarring confrontation with the pivotal role that women played in the preparation of the original Eucharist and its survival among the heretical Christian sects that the Vatican continues to battle to this day. An early secret form of Christianity that has been scrubbed from the record. I present every piece of evidence that, taken together, finally convinced me of the psychedelic reality behind Western civilization's original religion, a prehistoric ritual that survived for millennia in the total absence of the written word, before finding a good home among the Greeks, a tradition that was later inherited by the first Greek-speaking Christians, especially in Italy, where they came under attack by the Church Fathers. A vast knowledge of drugs that was kept alive through the Dark Ages by pagans and heretics, until the witches of the world were hunted down for centuries, erasing all memory of the longest-running religion the planet has ever known. The ancient Greece that invented democracy and birthed all the arts and sciences we now take for granted never heard of Jesus. Before Jerusalem, before Rome, before Mecca, there was Eleusis. If Athens of the 5th and 4th centuries BC was the true source of Western life in the 21st century, then Eleusis was our first undisputed spiritual capital. Throughout classical antiquity, the quaint harbor town was ground zero for generations of seekers. But its religion wouldn't last forever. In the battle for the sacred legacy of the West, Eleusis was a spectacular casualty. Its demise at the hands of the newly Christianized Roman Empire in the 4th century AD marked the beginning of an identity crisis that persists to this day. Today, the archaeological site of Eleusis is little more than crumbling bits of marble and limestone, and since 1882, the excavations have only turned up more questions than answers. Why did the pilgrims flock to this temple for 2,000 years in search of life beyond the grave? Why was the age-old ritual performed under cover of darkness? Why was the magic potion hidden away? And why did the Christians shut it all down? Unfortunately, it was shrouded in secrecy from the very beginning, leaving nothing but hints and clues about what really took place within the holy precinct. Aristotle once said, "The initiates came to Eleusis not to learn something, but to experience something." Whatever that experience was, it has successfully eluded scholars for centuries. That's how this puzzle was designed, after all. Fragments of the strange rites and ceremonies can be reconstructed, but the main attraction remains unknown. If you come to Eleusis, you will never die. A bold claim, for sure. Hard to believe nowadays. But for some reason, our ancestors believed it. In fact, they couldn't imagine a world without the exceptional landmark. The mysteries were said to hold the entire human race together. Life itself would be unlivable in their absence. Among all the unanswered questions about Eleusis, one inescapable fact keeps researchers glued to the obscure corner of southern Greece that spoke to millions. It stood the test of time. Well before Jesus walked the shores of Galilee, Eleusis was a beacon of hope in a nasty age of uncertainty, when the average life expectancy was much lower than today. But as long as the mysteries were celebrated once a year around the fall equinox, everything was in order. It was a foolproof formula that ran uninterrupted from about 1500 BC until AD 392, when the annual festivities were abruptly outlawed by the Roman Emperor Theodosius, a die-hard Christian. That's a long time for a lot of people to keep quiet, and for so little detail to leak into the historical record. But everyone who crossed the sacred threshold understood the price of admission. The word mystery comes from the Greek muo, which literally means to shut one's eyes. Under penalty of death, all visitors were explicitly forbidden from revealing what they saw on the inside. Whatever happened in Eleusis stayed in Eleusis. Frustrating as it is for modern historians, that policy served the mysteries well. The wall of silence only fed the mystique and guaranteed fans in high places. Like all travelers, Plato was permanently transformed by whatever he observed in Eleusis, the latest in a long line of visionaries, men and women, with exclusive access to cosmic truth. Following their sip of an unusual elixir called the Kukion, and a night of spectacles in the temple, each pilgrim earned the honorary title Epoptes, which means something like the one who has seen it all. Beyond any doubt, they claimed, death was not the end of our human journey. We do in fact survive the physical body, and underneath this mortal clothing, we are all immortals in disguise, gods and goddesses destined to the stars for eternity. All that after just one night at Eleusis.
I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I did find the book, well, it was of substantive intellectual interest, that's for sure. For anyone who's interested in the history of religious experience, it's quite the trip, let's say, but it was remarkably well plotted as well. It was a book that was very dense with information, but almost impossible to put down. And so that's quite the thing to pull off. So, and why did you do this? How did you do it?
I'm still trying to figure that out, Jordan, to be totally honest. It was my avocation. I mean, no one was writing checks for me to fly to the Mediterranean and look at ancient secrets. It's not the thing that you do when you're supposed to be a practicing attorney raising children. But this bug got into me, I guess, when I was a teenager. I was studying Latin and Greek with the Jesuits at an all-boys school. I got a scholarship to attend that school, otherwise would not have afforded to go. And then was recruited by Brown, as you mentioned, to study Latin and Greek and piled on some Sanskrit, some Arabic, and other things in between. And along the way, you hear about this best-kept secret in history. That's what Houston Smith, perhaps one of the greatest religious scholars of the 20th century, that's how he referred to these mysteries, and particularly the sacrament within these ancient mysteries, these sacramental potions that have since gone missing. You know, for a couple thousand years, we've been trying to crack this mystery to no avail. But there's Houston Smith saying it's a mystery worth investigating. And so I don't really know what to do with that. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there's not a lot of scholarship on ancient pharmacology. And I read this crazy book, The Road to Eleusis, which comes out in 1978. And I'm trying to figure out how the ancient Greeks could have consumed, a beer otherwise spiked with LSD. But there's no hard scientific data to support it. So I leave it to one side until 2007. And it was Roland Griffiths, who you recently talked to. It was his early studies with psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms. That began in the early 2000s. The initial results are released in 2006. doesn't come onto my radar until 2007. But what I'm reading about are people today, modern day volunteers, having a transformative experience from one and only dose of psilocybin. And Gordon Wasson is mentioned in the first line of this article, the God Pill. And it immediately reminds me of the road to Eleusis, and it reminds me of Eleusis itself 2,500 years ago. And this notion that it was a once in a lifetime psychedelic encounter that was very much part and parcel of the origins of Western civilization. So from there,
let's talk about the Eleusinian mysteries to begin with. Clue everybody in about what they were and why you believe, and what, not just you obviously, but why they're of enduring significance, both to us now, but also you make the case in the book that the very essence of Greek civilization, from which so much of our civilization is derived, was rooted in these hallucinogenic mysteries, essentially, or at least in the Eleusinian mysteries. And so please elaborate on the mysteries and their significance.
So we say the ancient mysteries. There were lots of mysteries in the ancient world, the mysteries of Eleusis, the mysteries of Dionysus, the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. But Eleusis, which today is this relatively small town of only about 30,000 people, 13 miles northwest of Athens, for about 2,000 years, it was kind of the epicenter of the Mediterranean spiritual universe. It was not a sideshow. I sometimes refer to it as the real religion of the ancient Greeks, and the best and brightest among them. It called to initiates like Plato, Pindar, Cicero, who actually called it the most divine thing that Athens ever produced, the most divine thing. So not democracy, the arts and sciences and philosophy, but Eleusis. Marcus Aurelius famously rebuilt Eleusis when it was almost destroyed. So it mattered to these people, both to the Greeks.
Your case in the book, like you lay out your belief that the Eleusinian mysteries were absolutely central to the animating spirit of Greek civilization. So it wasn't rationality versus the mysteries of Dionysius, let's say. It was rationality embedded in some more profound religious experience that was integrally related with whatever was happening at Eleusis.
Absolutely integral. And we can say that with a straight face and very confidently because of the way its destruction is recorded in the 4th century AD under the newly Christianized Roman Empire. So at the time, in the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Valentinian tries to get rid of Eleusis, and we have the testimony of this high priest, Praetextatus, who says literally that life in the absence of Eleusis would be unlivable, abiotos in Greek. And so there's lots of ways to translate that or interpret that. But even Carl Kerenyi, this famous classicist writing in the 1960s, he looks at that language and says, the sharpness of this formulation, that life is unlivable without the mysteries, has no precedent in Greek literature. Even Carl doesn't know what to make of this. And he draws a distinction.
He worked with Jung, Carl Kerenyi, as well.
Exactly right.
Published with Bollingen. Yeah, very impressive scholar.
And this impressive scholar didn't know what to make of this testimony from Praetextatus. And he thinks that Praetextatus is clearly drawing a distinction between what was available in the pagan mysteries versus what was available in the rise of Christianity at that time in the 4th century. So again, Eleusis is bound up not just with the notion of Greek existence, but human existence and the survival of our species.
According to custom, Maria cleansed and blessed some fresh psilocybe mexicana that Wasson had handpicked earlier in the day. She instructed him to consume 6 of the mushrooms, which would flood his system with the psychoactive agent psilocybin. After a half hour of deafening silence amid total blackness, the adventure finally began. Over the course of the next 5 hours, Wasson recalled, the visions came whether our eyes were open or closed. He saw everything from resplendent palaces all laid over with semi-precious stones to a mythological beast drawing a regal chariot. At one point he witnessed his spirit leave his body and shoot to the heavens. Oddly, the whole trip was seared into Wasson's memory as the realest thing he'd ever experienced. He recorded his grand epiphany in an article entitled Seeking the Magic Mushroom. It would appear in the May 13, 1957 issue of Life magazine. The visions were not blurred or uncertain, they were sharply focused, the lines and colors being so sharp that they seemed more real to me than anything I had ever seen with my own eyes. I felt that I was now seeing plain, whereas ordinary vision gives us an imperfect view. I was seeing the archetypes, the Platonic ideas, that underlie the imperfect images of everyday life. The thought crossed my mind, could the divine mushrooms be the secret that lay behind the ancient mysteries? A well-read individual, Wasson was very familiar with the testimony from Eleusis. He instantly identified with the ancient initiates, absolutely certain he had stumbled upon something that brought incredible meaning to our ancestors, but had somehow escaped the attention of modern scholars. How an echo of the Greek ritual had survived in the mountains of Mexico became a burning question that Wasson would dedicate the rest of his life to answering. In a single line of ancient Greek texts from the 7th century BC, Wasson and Hoffman noticed something that had been largely overlooked for more than 2,500 years. The Homeric hymn to Demeter is one of those random clues that somehow made it past the wall of silence surrounding Eleusis. A beautifully crafted poem, it recounts the legend of Demeter's epic search for her daughter, Persephone, the two goddesses to whom the mysteries were consecrated. In the meantime, however, the more immediate concern was having Maria Sabina's mushrooms scientifically catalogued. He sent some spores to Switzerland to be cultivated by his friend and future co-author. Albert Hoffman was already an internationally renowned chemist. In 1938 he had struck psychedelic gold at his research laboratory in Basel by extracting LSD from special cultures of ergot, a naturally occurring fungus. From Wasson's samples, Hoffman was able to successfully isolate psilocybin as well, laying the groundwork for the experiments at Hopkins and NYU in recent years. Together, Wasson and Hoffman would unwittingly spark the pop psychedelic revolution that was to come. Thanks in no small part to Aldous Huxley and his eloquent marketing in The Doors of Perception, millions of people would read Wasson's essay in Life. At Wasson's request, Hoffman tracked down and analyzed the ergot of wheat and barley, both of which would have been plentiful on the Rarian plain so explicitly showcased in the hymn of Demeter. He found they indeed contained two psychoactive alkaloids, ergonovine and lysergic acid amide. Both are soluble in water, meaning with the techniques and equipment available in antiquity it was therefore easy to prepare a hallucinogenic extract, assuming, of course, that the herbalists of ancient Greece were as intelligent and resourceful as the herbalists of pre-conquest Mexico. Amazingly, Wasson's hunch 20 years earlier had been spot on. There's no psychopharmacological reason why the ancient ergot of Eleusis couldn't have had the same effect as its chemical cousins, Hoffman's LSD-25, or the psilocybin resident in Maria Sabina's mushrooms. It's all fungus in the end. But is this really why barley figures so conspicuously in the hymn of Demeter? A solitary line of poetry from the 7th century BC seems like an awfully slim piece of evidence, but it's where this puzzle begins. Wasson and Hoffman thought they had made a breakthrough, but they had to admit their shortcomings. They were up against the oldest and most pedantic discipline in the academy, and they needed every scrap of ancient literary and archaeological data that could possibly support their novel theory. Frankly, they were in way over their heads. The mushroom hunter and the drug maker would be laughed out of the room unless they teamed up with a legitimate classicist to construct an airtight case. When enough doors had been slammed in their face, they finally found their champion in the Harvard and Yale trained Carl Ruck, then chair of the classics department at Boston University. Neither Wasson nor Hoffman had much to lose. Wasson, then 79, was independently wealthy, free from the politics and constraints of the university system. Hoffman, then 72, had comfortably retired from the Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland, which is now called Novartis, still a leading multinational company in the pharmaceutical industry. Ruck, the youngest member of the trio at 42, had everything to lose, for consorting was public enemy number one, and he lost it hard. Nowhere in his published material or lectures could I find the actual details of Ruck's fall from grace, or what provoked such a vicious reaction from his colleagues. So after almost a decade of obsessing over his scholarship, I finally reached out to the reclusive professor in the early summer of 2018. On page 61 of The Road to Eleusis, he expresses his confidence in the evidence he painstakingly assembled to support Wasson and Hoffman. His bigger challenge, the biggest challenge of all, would be convincing people that the rational Greeks, and indeed some of the most famous and intelligent among them, could experience and enter fully into such irrationality. This is the book, The Road to Eleusis, Unveiling the Secret of the Mysteries, by Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, and Carl Ruck. There's the good old American kind of irrationality, like the cowboy's taste for whiskey and cigarettes, and then there are psychedelics. By the late 1970s, few things were considered more irrational, un-American, or perverse. For silver, they represented a complete rejection of the very things our Greek ancestors and founding fathers worked so very hard to establish. Purposeful things like law and order, common sense, and clean living. If it leaked that the greatest minds in the ancient world were avid drug users, wouldn't that give free license to all the LSD-loving, mushroom-eating, pot-smoking hippies out there? It would spell the end of civilization as we know it. Silver instantly turned Ruck into a persona non grata by demoting the classicists and cutting him off from students and peers alike. A man on a mission since the road to Eleusis first debuted, Rock has spent the past 4 decades obsessively trying to prove that the Greeks found God in a mind-altering cocktail brewed by witches. Yes, it was an elite school of priestesses who prepared and dispensed the potion at Eleusis. Would Demeter have it any other way? The lady of the grain, who brought the chauvinistic Zeus and his kidnapping, sex-offending brother to their knees? The mysteries were always the women's domain. At first, as a matter of fact, women were the only ones who were eligible for initiation. This curious little detail might be connected to the birth and spread of Christianity, Rock soon realized. In Rock's analysis of the Gospels, Paul's letters, and other Greek language documents of the era, the earliest generations of Christians inherited a mind-altering sacrament from the Greeks, replacing Demeter's beer with Dionysus wine as the vehicle for the psychedelic kick. For Christianity to compete with the eye-opening experience at Eleusis or the Dionysian ecstasy that had spread through the mountains and forests of the ancient Mediterranean, it needed a hook. At the time, what was more enticing than the legendary Kukeon or the spiked grape elixir of Dionysus, to whom a third of all festivals in ancient Greece were dedicated, rather than restrict its use to a special pilgrimage site or the wilderness of Greece and Italy, did the early church domesticate the ancient potion? No longer locked up in Demeter's temple in Eleusis, or splashed over the trees and rocks of the Dionysian backcountry. The proto-mass could then be celebrated in the house churches and underground catacombs that defined early Christianity in the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death. It was there, in private homes and tombs, that the Paleo-Christians used to gather to ingest their holy meal of bread and wine. The mind-altering Eucharist would be an excellent recruitment tool for the pagan converts who had grown up hearing about the Eleusinian and Dionysian mysteries from their parents and grandparents, mysteries they one day might aspire to see for themselves, especially if the would-be Christians in Greece could literally walk to Eleusis from Corinth, or the would-be Christians in Rome could steal into the night to join any of the female-led Dionysian bacchanals that were still raging across southern Italy. What if rock scholarship, scorned and sidelined for 40 years, could finally answer the charges of irrelevancy and impracticality that threaten to scrub dead languages from the university curriculum altogether? What if this ultimate outsider, with no place in the academy, could once again demonstrate the critical importance of classics at a time when the world might need it most.
That's what drove the imagination until 2007, when psychedelics came on my mental radar and propelled me on this journey for another 12 years.
All right, well, let's walk through the journey. Tell us what you did first.
Well, I used my law firm's salary to purchase every book that Ruck himself had ever written, and Wasson and Hofmann. Then I started reading about Terence McKenna quite a bit, and was reading his information and listening to his lectures. And I spent most of the day doing that for a couple of years. And then I started to realize that some newer disciplines like the archaeobotany and archaeochemistry that you mentioned earlier, and with the advance of technology, new tools, new techniques, we were suddenly able to peer back into history in a way that we never could before. In other words, things like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and these wonderful, lab additions had allowed us to look into, to peer into these ancient containers, these cups and these chalices and these grails of sorts, and tell us for certain, relatively certain, what our ancestors were consuming and why. And this is all relatively new. This did not exist in 1978. And so that was a big break for me in this research, trying to, attract the hard scientific data to prove this one way or the other.
You spent a lot of time in the book writing about beer, for example.
Mainly
and make a case too that one of the motivating factors for the development of agriculture was likely the easy transformation of barley into alcoholic beverage, or perhaps not just alcoholic. But I thought that was also a very interesting speculation. So maybe we can talk about that a bit.
It's mainly because I like beer, and it was a great excuse to go to Germany to talk to a beer scientist to talk about beer, which was a lot of fun. And beer could go back 12,000 years. As a matter of fact, beer might be responsible for the birth of civilization as we know it. If you look to Göbekli Tepe, for example, about 10 years ago, there was some evidence from this giant, site of megalithic architecture, sometimes described as the world's first temple. Turns out the world's first temple might be the world's first bar in this giant megalithic site. This, by the way, is 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the high civilizations of Egypt and Sumeria. But in this site, they did find initial traces of calcium oxalate, which points to beer fermentation. And at the time, it might be safer to drink some beer versus some water in some cases. And so it could very well be the case that beer is bound up with these ancient sites, with ancient ritual, these T-shaped pillars meant to be the depictions of early gods. It's possible that there was some intoxicating affair there. We don't know for certain, but beer could go back an awfully long way.
Right.
It encouraged me to ask very fundamental questions about the origins of the faith and this whole pagan continuity idea that we can talk about, this transference from the pagan world to the Christian world and what it all means.
Okay, so this provided you with some insight into what might have been going on with the ancient mysteries. And of course, there's other scholars who push in towards that conclusion, let's say, like Dr. Ruck, who we're going to talk to later. Gordon Wasson, for example, who's mentioned continually in your book, made the claim that the Amanita muscaria mushroom was the soma of the ancient Hindus, was the inspiration for the Rig Veda. And Mircea Eliade, who worked with Carigny and also with Jung, wrote a great book on shamanism. I don't know if you know the book, you likely do, but Eliade claimed that the use of hallucinogens among the shamanic practitioners was a deviation from the historical norm. But I think the bulk of the evidence that's been accrued since Eliade wrote his great book, because it is a great book, Shamanism, it's a great book. I think he was wrong about that. I think it's absolutely crystal clear that throughout human history, for at least 50,000 years, perhaps longer than that, our spiritual guides, especially in the archaic world, were using whatever hallucinogenic substances they could get their hands on with their vast knowledge of local biology to produce these mystical experiences. And we have no idea to what degree that shaped us culturally, or how that shaped our religious structures, beliefs, presumptions, all of that. And so that would make Eleusis a continuation of the shamanic tradition. And so I think it fits nicely into the anthropological literature in that manner. And the interest in the hallucinogenic element of it, what was that a consequence of your knowledge that something was being used as a sacrament, some substance was being used as a sacrament, Atelosis in particular, or is there more to it than that?
So this is the great irony is that I've never experimented with psychedelics. That's the great irony of this book and all this research, because it really was Roland's work at Hopkins that just, it hit me like a punch in the face. The idea of people experiencing psilocybin and over the course of a few hours having their lives completely transformed. You know, not just positive changes in attitudes, behaviors, and belief, but fundamental psychological change in an afternoon. If I had to come up with a definition of eleusis, that would be it, except it was
I
an
see. So you saw the connection. But it wasn't a consequence of personal experience. It was a consequence of intellectual realization.
That's what it was. And those numbers have stayed consistent, Roland will tell you. When I asked him before publishing the book if this number still makes sense, he will tell me that 75% of these volunteers will report that their one and only dose of psilocybin remains one of the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives, if not the most meaningful experience. And this is data going back 20 years now.